Hello, my world history students, and welcome to part 4 of the 4-part series dealing with World War I and its end. These are notes 12.2d, and this is, of course, Mr. Marks. With the war coming to an end, the questions of what to do in order to make sure that this kind of war wouldn't happen again are already being asked even before the war comes to its end. On January 8th of 1918, Woodrow Wilson, in his State of the Union address, is going to, well, actually his speech to Congress, he's going to outline what's known as his 14 points. These are 14 points which he feels are necessary to make certain that something like this never happens again. They're going to include the creation of a League of Nations, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. They're going to talk about the need to not have unfair war reparations, and again we're going to talk about what happens with that later on. And they're going to talk about ways for countries to solve their disputes without actually going to war. These 14 points were very much applauded by many European nations, but were not taken as fondly really from the United States side of this. Woodrow Wilson was really, he already believed that the United States was going to win the war, but he was really pushing for ways to ensure that the peaceful resolution to the war can come to an end with both sides coming to an agreement rather than it having to be won through battles or war. Some people were skeptical of Woodrow Wilson's idealism. And while this is used well before the war, while this comes out well before the war, or before the end of the war, when Germany agrees to its final armistice, it's going to expect that the European nations are going to follow Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. They believe that the other European nations, by talking about how much they liked them, would use this as a blueprint for the peace settlement. They're going to end up being wrong. In order to stop the Allied advance to go right through Germany itself, and German factories had been bombed much as French factories and people and towns had been bombed, Germany agrees to an armistice before it comes to its final actual peace treaty. An armistice is a ceasefire. This happens at 1 a.m. on November 11th, 1918. Thus, it's on the 11th day of the 11th month. Armistice Day is still celebrated throughout much of Europe, though the United States celebrates it as Veterans Day, as instead of just celebrating the end of World War I, we use it as a chance to celebrate the veterans from all of the wars that the United States has been involved in. This happens in a French forest. The peace treaty or the armistice is actually signed in this railroad car, as pictured here. Well, in this picture, it's important to remember the railroad car. You're going to it's going to be seen later on when the final terms of the peace treaty are known to Germans. This railroad car is going to become a symbol for how the French have abused the German people. Adolf Hitler is going to remember this. Railroad car, and he's actually going to use it himself for as a means of embarrassing France when he begins his invasion in World War II. So, June 1919, the armistice has been on for about 6 months. The Treaty of Versailles comes about. Now, by this time, German forces have pulled back and they've lost all advantage. As the German diplomats start to read this, they realize that things really aren't right. This document forces Germany to take all of the blame for the war. Never mind that Russia had declared war against Austria-Hungary first. Never mind that France had declared war on Germany, or that the whole thing had started in Sarajevo. Germany is now fully responsible. That means that, according to the French, that the German people will have to pay for all war damages. Now, the French people were in bad shape. They had lost an entire generation of young men, often known as the lost generation. The Americans writers will end up taking on that same term later on to describe themselves for different reasons. These reparations are supposed to not only cover the damages of the war, but also the pensions of the Allied soldiers and their widows and their families. The total cost for German reparations at the time was $30 billion. This, this would put Germany even more in debt if you end up taking inflation into account. This puts Germany even more in debt than that huge debt that they're talking about right now for the United States. It's an unheard of number, and it would completely cripple the Germans' economy. There were other clauses that were used to weaken Germany. One made it so that the size of the German army couldn't be larger than a set number. It demilitarized the area along the Rhineland, the area of the Rhine River, which was the border between France and Germany. It would return portions of Germany that had been consolidated under Bismarck back under the control of France, that had been in German control ever since the Franco-Prussian War. And it will take away all of Germany's overseas colonies and divide them up amongst the other nations of the other Allied nations. The Germans signed this basically because they have no choice, but it is a humiliating treaty for them to sign. And worse, there is a lot of evidence that this is what will eventually lead the entire world into a Great Depression, because Germany's industry is going to be largely spent just having to pay these reparations. Reparations are repayment in compensation for some sort of wrongdoing. If you vandalize a neighbor's house or something, the law usually says that you have to repay your neighbor for the damages done to that. That's a reparation. In this case, these are reparations from Germany in order to help rebuild all of the industry in France. This is an actual picture of many of the machinery, pieces of machinery that Germany was required to send over to France in order to pay off its reparations. The difficulty with this was that the German economy was already in shambles due to the war. Allied bombers, Allied forces had been attacking German towns. Factories in Germany had been blown up and devastated, and Germany wasn't able to use any money because in order to help rebuild those things before paying the reparations, because it was required to give all that money up as well. This is a very devastating cycle of events that was completely against Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Woodrow Wilson wanted to make it clear that no country should have to pay the reparations for this war, as almost all of them were equally to blame for it, and that by forcing countries to pay this reparations would actually would build resentment in the country that's forced to pay it, and would eventually lead to an even greater war. It would turn out that Woodrow Wilson's words would be almost prophetic in what happened. One point of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points did end up coming through, and that would be the building of a League of Nations. The League of Nations does not exist today, and for reasons that we'll talk about as we lead up to World War II. But this was an idea based on collective security. The idea was people could meet at the League of Nations, and that all of the nations in that league would agree that any person that started fighting the nations that were in the league would suffer consequences by the League of Nations itself. The idea was that all of these nations would be motivated to try to find peaceful solutions to their problems. With the League of Nations in place, Woodrow Wilson actually felt a little bit more confident that the Treaty of Versailles would end up getting fixed as the nations would start to realize just how lopsided it was. However, he would not be able to point it out himself because the United States would refuse to join the League of Nations. Woodrow Wilson's popularity as president would bring about a lot of jealousy from Congress, who wanted to limit his powers because of his role in World War I. And so, with public sentiment turned against him, the United States will actually even refuse to sign the Treaty of Versailles. It will form separate peace treaties with Germany and Austria and such, but won't do that a larger collective one. And as part of that, they will not join the League of Nations. Without the United States and the power of the now growing U.S. military to back it up, the League of Nations is going to be a fairly toothless lion. In review, what were some of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points? When was the armistice signed? Why is the Treaty of Versailles considered to be an unfair treaty? And what was the purpose of the League of Nations?